January 14th, 1940. Paris, France. The chalkboard in the small classroom was cracked in places, a faint line running across the middle from years of use. Margot Dupont stood before it, her hands trembling slightly as she adjusted the small pile of textbooks on the desk. The school was empty except for the low murmur of the city outside, the sounds of people trying to live through the days that seemed to stretch endlessly into dark uncertainty. It was the early days of the Nazi occupation, and even the sunlight felt muted, shrouded in the fog of impending change. Her gaze fell to the front of the room, where the once proud French flag now hung limp, its colors dulled by the shadow of the new regime that had swept across the country like an unwelcome tide. Margot knew the children would be back soon. She heard their laughter in the hallways earlier, faint but real, as if their innocence hadn't yet been entirely swallowed by the weight of the world. She envied them, those children, oblivious to the harshness of what was unfolding outside their classroom windows. The world, for them, was still a place of stories, of mathematics and literature, where right and wrong had clear lines. But that world was slowly being erased, replaced by one where the truth was censored, and lies were carefully sculpted to serve the powers that now control their lives. But for Margot, a teacher who had spent nearly a decade in the same classroom, the truth was something worth fighting for, even if the battle was being fought with a whisper rather than a shout. She had always believed in the power of education, not just to impart knowledge, but to instill a sense of justice, of empathy, of duty to something greater than oneself. That had been the core of her teaching philosophy. But now, in the era of occupation, the ideals she once held were being twisted into something unrecognizable. The curriculum was no longer about building minds. It was about building soldiers. History was being rewritten, French culture was being erased, and the youth of France were being molded into obedient citizens of a foreign empire. Margot felt that weight pressing against her chest every day she stepped into the classroom. The system had changed, but her responsibility to her students had not. Her first class of the day filed in, mostly boys. She could see the uncertainty in their eyes as they sat at their desks. Some were barely old enough to understand the full scope of what was happening to them, to their country, while others had already felt the sting of occupation. One of the older boys, Pierre, had lost his father in the early days of the invasion. His mother still struggled to hide the sadness in her eyes when she greeted Margot each morning at the door. The others came from families whose livelihoods were now tethered to the whims of a foreign government, each one carrying the silent weight of loss, fear, or hope, but never all three at once. They were all, in their own way, struggling to find their place in a world that was rapidly falling apart. Today we will begin with the works of Voltaire, Margot announced in her usual soft tone, but something in her voice lingered longer than it had before. She had been teaching French literature for years, but now, each lesson seemed more like an act of rebellion than an exercise in academic rigor. Voltaire, the great critic of intolerance, the philosopher who had been exiled for his radical ideas, had become a symbol of something larger. She didn't say it aloud, but as her eyes met those of the students in front of her, she saw that they understood. At least some of them did. She opened the book to the first page, her fingers grazing the worn edges of the pages. Voltaire once said, "We must cultivate our garden." A reminder that even in the darkest times, we must continue to nurture what is good and true. She paused, waiting for a reaction, but the room stayed silent. Her words, though seemingly innocuous, carried weight. In an age where freedom of thought was increasingly at risk, a teacher's small act of defiance was a fragile thing. Outside, the steady thrum of marching soldiers could be heard faintly, and Margot's heart clenched. She knew the consequences of defiance in this new world. Teachers who were deemed uncooperative were disappearing. There were rumors of mass arrests and secret deportations. Even the slightest act of resistance could bring the full weight of the regime crashing down on her head. She had heard the whispers among her colleagues, the hushed conversations that spoke of safety in silence. But silence was something Margot could not afford. Now when she had the power to shape minds, to preserve the legacy of her people, even if only for a few moments longer. The first hour passed with a tense stillness. The students focused on their books, but unsure of what to make of her words. There were no questions, no eager hands raised to offer answers. Only the unspoken understanding that this lesson, like so many others, was a quiet rebellion against the tyranny that threatened to engulf them. For the first time in a long time, Margot could feel the weight of her words in the room. The classroom had become a battlefield. She wasn't just teaching history or literature anymore. She was teaching resistance. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but in every lesson, she was passing on the tools her students would need to fight back against the erasure of their culture. And then came the turning point. After the bell rang and the students shuffled out, Pierre lingered by the door, as he often did. His eyes, usually bright with a mischievous glint, were clouded today. "Madame Dupont," he said quietly, his voice betraying a mix of uncertainty and something else, something heavier. "Are we doing the right thing? With what we're learning, is it worth the risk?" Margot took a breath. She looked down at him, seeing the weight of a young boy burdened by the knowledge of what was happening to his world. She wanted to tell him the truth, the whole truth, but the words stuck in her throat. She couldn't promise him safety. She couldn't guarantee that they would win this fight. But she could show him what it meant to resist, even in the face of overwhelming odds. "It's always worth the risk, Pierre," she said, her voice softer now, steadying herself. "Even if we're the only ones who remember." As Pierre walked out the door, Margot turned back to the classroom, where the chalkboard still carried the faint residue of her last lesson. The door clicked shut behind him, but in that moment, the silence in the room felt different. It wasn't the silence of submission. It was the silence of something more dangerous. The silence of rebellion waiting to be born. May 23rd, 1942. Vichy, France. The days had stretched into months, and the war felt endless, like a dark cloud hanging over their heads, thick and oppressive. Margot stood at the window, staring out at the Parisian street below, now a place she barely recognized. The world had changed so fundamentally in the last 2 years. Once a vibrant city of culture, freedom, and pride, Paris had become a ghost of its former self, haunted by soldiers marching through its streets, by the silence that clung to every corner. The French resistance was still a whisper, a secret tucked away in the shadows, but it was growing stronger now than it had ever been. And Margot, the quiet teacher, had become more than just a bystander. She was part of that whisper. The classroom, once a place of learning, had turned into a quiet refuge of rebellion. Over time, Margot had come to understand the weight of her position. She was no longer just imparting knowledge. She was shaping the future. Her students, a group of young boys and girls who had once sat passively in their seats, now came to her with eyes wide open, burning with the desire to do something, anything to fight back. They were no longer the innocent, unaware children they had once been. No, now there was something else entirely. Agents of change, soldiers in their own right, armed with nothing but their intellect and their will to survive. Pierre, the boy who had first asked her if it was worth the risk, had become her closest ally in the classroom. He had grown quieter, more determined. His father's death had changed him, hardened him in ways that only tragedy could. He was no longer just a student. He had become an emissary for the resistance, bringing messages and information to Margot in the secrecy of the classroom. His eyes had darkened with the weight of his new role, but there was also a spark of something else in him now. Resolve. He had seen the devastation firsthand, and he wasn't content to sit back and wait for the world to change. "Madame Dupont," he whispered one day after class, his voice barely audible. "The resistance is asking for more help. We need to spread the word faster. We need to get information to the Allies. The city is crawling with informants, but we can still make a difference." Margot nodded, her heart heavy with both fear and pride. She knew exactly what that meant. Pierre was no longer talking about just hiding pamphlets or whispering slogans. He was talking about real, life-threatening work, sabotage, smuggling information, even planning for the day when the Allies would land on French soil and the fighting would move into the streets. It had started slowly, with Margot giving small, seemingly innocuous assignments to her students. Reading forbidden texts, collecting and passing on information about troop movements, or memorizing obscure codes. The students, at first hesitant, had grown bolder, more confident in their small acts of rebellion. Margot didn't ask them to do anything they weren't ready for, but she didn't hold them back either. She became their mentor, their guide through the treacherous waters of war, teaching them how to think critically, how to read between the lines of the news and the propaganda, how to understand the power of words, of knowledge, in a world where both were being systematically twisted. The tension in the classroom had shifted. There were no more frivolous distractions or idle chatter. Every lesson, every moment, was heavy with the knowledge that each student, each one of them, was playing a part in something larger than themselves. They were no longer simply learning for the sake of education. They were learning to resist, to fight back against an occupying force that sought to erase their identity, their culture, their very existence. The classroom had become a training ground for something more than academics. It had become a place for revolution. They spoke in code, laughed in whispers, and passed notes that meant more than just homework. Pierre was not alone in his new role. There was Lucy, a bright, stubborn girl with a sharp mind and an even sharper sense of justice. She had been the first to bring back information about Nazi patrols in their area, a small but invaluable piece of intelligence. Then there was Henri, a boy who had once been shy and withdrawn but now exuded a quiet, determined strength. Henri had found a way to get their messages past the German checkpoints, hidden in the innocent-looking books that the occupying soldiers had no interest in. It was a simple trick, but it worked. Every day, after class, they gathered in the back of the room, their heads bent together, eyes darting nervously toward the door. There were moments when the air felt thick, as if they were all holding their breath, waiting for someone to notice, to catch on. But there was also a sense of exhilaration, a shared secret that bound them together in ways they couldn't fully articulate. They had become a family of sorts, bound not by blood but by the belief that they could do something, anything, to fight back. But the fear never went away. The danger of being caught was ever present, lurking in every shadow, every misplaced glance, every word spoken too loudly. Margot had seen what happened to those who were caught. Her colleagues who had disappeared, the people who had been dragged away in the middle of the night, never to be seen again. The thought of her students, her friends, suffering that fate was enough to make her stomach turn. But still, they pushed forward. They had no choice. One afternoon, as the students filed out of the classroom, Margot found herself alone with Pierre again. He lingered by the door, looking older than his 15 years. There was a new tension in his face, a hardness that hadn't been there before. She noticed the small bundle of papers hidden in his jacket, a stack of messages he had been entrusted with to deliver to the underground network. "Madame Dupont," he said, his voice steady despite the weight of the task. "This is getting bigger. We need to be ready for more." Margot felt a lump rise in her throat. The responsibility that had begun so quietly, in small, subtle ways, had grown into something vast and uncontrollable. She had never imagined that a classroom, a place of learning and safety, would become the heart of a resistance movement. But in a time when everything seemed to be crumbling, it was the students, these young, brave souls, who were standing tall. "Just remember," Margot said, her voice low but firm, "everything we do has consequences. We may not see the end of this, but we must act as though we will." Pierre nodded, his eyes filled with something she couldn't quite place, determination, perhaps, or fear. But there was something else there, something deeper, a silent understanding that they had crossed a line from which there was no return. And then, without a word, he turned and left. The room was quiet once more. But it wasn't the silence of resignation. It was the silence of something being built. The storm was coming, and they were ready. November 7th, 1944. Paris, France. The streets of Paris were no longer the same. The Nazi flags that once hung from every building had been torn down, replaced with the tricolor of the French resistance. But the air still felt heavy, as though the city had not yet fully shaken the weight of the occupation. The cafes, which had once been a gathering place for intellectuals, artists, and poets, now seemed tired, as if they, too, had aged beyond their years in the last few dark, oppressive years. The sounds of war, bombs, the clatter of military boots, the murmurs of secret alliances, had left an indelible mark on the fabric of the city. Yet, amidst the silence of liberation, there was an unsettling feeling in the streets, a collective amnesia, as if the city was trying to forget everything it had endured, everything that had been lost, in an attempt to rebuild. Margot Dupont had survived. Her classroom, once a place of quiet defiance, had seen the deaths of many of her students, and the rest had scattered into the winds of war. Some had returned as soldiers, others as heroes, while some had never come back at all. Pierre was one of the few who had made it out, though he carried the scars of war, physically and emotionally. He had become a different person, a man who bore the weight of the resistance in his eyes, but still he had survived. The others, Lucy, Henri, and the others, had been lost to history, their names faded from the books, their stories erased by the very machine they had fought to destroy. In the aftermath of the war, there had been celebrations, of course. The streets had been filled with the sound of joy and victory, but for Margot, there was only silence. She walked through the city, past the monuments and the newly erected statues of the men who had led the charge against the Nazis. They were celebrated. Their names were etched in marble. But the names of the true heroes, those like her students, the ones who had taken up arms not with rifles, but with knowledge and courage, were absent. The city had moved on. The world had moved on. Margot's role in the resistance was now a footnote in history, if it was mentioned at all. She was one of the many teachers who had risked their lives to educate a generation that would grow up in a world forever changed by the scars of war. But there was no place for people like her in the narrative the new government wanted to construct. She had not been a soldier. She had not fought in the streets or been part of the grand military campaigns that had led to France's liberation. She had been a teacher, a guide, a quiet force behind the scenes. Her contribution was invisible, hidden in the small acts of rebellion, the whispered lessons, the coded messages passed from one generation to the next. One day, she was invited to a ceremony in her honor, an official recognition of her work during the war. The government had decided it was time to acknowledge the role of women in the resistance, and Margot was among the few who had survived long enough to receive a medal. The event was held in a grand hall filled with the politicians, generals, and dignitaries who had played their part in France's liberation. Margot stood at the back, feeling out of place. The room buzzed with excitement, but it felt distant to her. The applause, the speeches, the flashing cameras, it all seemed like a performance she had not been invited to watch. When her name was called, she stepped forward hesitantly, her heart pounding in her chest. The applause was polite, distant. She was handed a medal, a simple piece of silver, inscribed with the words "for courage and service to the nation." But it felt empty in her hands. The medal was not for her, not truly. It was for the public's need to remember, to have a tangible token for the sacrifices made, a way to justify their newfound freedom. She had known this moment was coming, and yet it still hurt, a sharp sting in her chest. She had been part of something real, something important, but now, standing in front of these strangers, it felt as if the history she had lived through had already been rewritten. She returned to her small apartment afterward, her medal still in its box, tucked away in a drawer. She had not kept it for herself. It was a symbol of something that she could never truly claim, something that would never reflect the quiet courage of the students she had taught, the lives they had touched, the sacrifices they had made. The city, the country, had already moved past them,